Hi, friends. Welcome to Igniting Imagination. I'm your host, Lisa Greenwood, and joining me is my co host for this season, Reverend Kathi McShane. Hey, Kathi.
Hi, Lisa.
It's good to be together again.
It's really good.
So, friends, if you skipped the first episode of this season, please do go back and listen. This season, we're exploring the themes that we're paying attention to that are glimpses of what will be essential and critical to the future church. And yet, as you hear them, you may also say, well, this isn't anything new. And that's true because they're happening right now. The invitation is to pay attention to the depths of these topics, the expressions of them that we are seeing today that are guideposts into the future. Our guests will help us have eyes to see, and I can't wait for you to hear today's conversation with Elan Babchuck and Vipin Thekk as we explore today's theme, power. Kathi, will you share their brief bios?
Sure, happy to. Vipin is the founder of the Changemaker Communities Initiative, which it weaves together all kinds of influential institutions in our society, government, teachers, all kinds of public institutions in cities that support the next generation of changemakers. He's constantly creating new programs that help people connect and bring their whole selves to their work and how to discover their power to become change makers. And I have to add here, he was one of my primary partners as we created the Changemaker initiative in a church in California. Vipin's most recent important contribution to this work is something he calls the Togetherness practice. And there's a link to that in our show notes. Rabbi Elan Babchuck is my co-author of the book, Picking Up the Pieces, Leadership After Empire, and he's a very dear friend. He's committed to leaving the world a better and more compassionate and connected place than it was as when he founded. In service to that commitment, Elan serves as the executive vice president at Clal, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. And he's the founding executive director of Glean Network, which is an incubator and a network for entrepreneurs who are building new models of faith in action all across religions.
So, Kathi, what stood out to you?
I was reminded of what extraordinary thinkers they have. Each of them and both of them together have this capacity to sort of combine cultural observation with this deep spiritual insight. And that helps them sort of interpret the dynamics of power and to sort of cast a different light on power and how it influences relationships. Lisa, what stood out to you in this conversation?
So I was struck by the way they talked about power as something that is found and formed between us. And it makes it all that much more important that we tend to the relational field between us because it has implications for how we exude, use power in our world, in our communities, in our families, in our workplaces. So when we tend that relational field, I think we actually perhaps maybe lend a little more power to the Holy Spirit at work. I pray that will be so. Anyway, it was a fascinating conversation, and so let's listen to our conversation with Elan and Vipin. Elan and Vipin, it is so good to be with you. Thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, same. Thank you.
So, we want to explore several topics with you too, but the central theme in this is power, and particularly thinking about the role of power and how it is used and distributed and how it shows up in the new spiritual landscape that is emerging today. And so it feels appropriate to start with Elan and Kathi, actually, because you all wrote a book that draws on this theme of power called Picking Up the Pieces, Leadership After Empire. And I should say to listeners that we did a podcast with Elan and Kathi about the book back in season 9. And so I hope that you'll check it out. But for our theme today, Elan and Kathi, can you start us out by telling us what the role of power is in leadership after empire? Just to start with a light question.
Well, I think that there's a myriad of ways to answer it. I'll give you what I believe to be a really simple one: is that power acts in very mysterious ways. Like I guess I'm quoting you too there, right? But power is not something you can see. It is not something you can feel. It is not tactile, right? But to say someone is power, holds power, the only way that you can really know that is by the ways that it manifests in the world, right? So I can tell you, I work in a high trust organization, and you can walk in my office and have no idea that people trust each other, that we trust God, that we trust the movement of spirit in the world. The only way you'll know that is by the way that it manifests. And I can tell you, I am in a high love family. Now, I could say I love you to everyone in my family, but if I'm not showing it, if it doesn't manifest in real ways that they can feel, that they can experience to feel loved, then it's just words. So I think when Kathi and I started thinking and talking and researching about this idea of how power operates in this framework of leadership after empire, right? It's that we can the first step is actually acknowledging where power lies now and how power manifests now. And until we can be really and sometimes brutally honest and vulnerable about the ways that power does operate inside of our organizations, in our relationships, in our communities and neighborhoods and politics, then we can't really begin to imagine what it might look like in this after empire world that Kathi and I are so committed to building, that all of us are so committed to building, but that is still not manifest yet, right? It's the not yet of how power can operate. Now, the last thing I'll say is this, is that the key to imagining that world is by holding to the idea that any power that is held solely by one individual is likely to not bring about the kind of world that we all dream about. So it's the power between people, it's the power among people, it's the power in relationship that holds the greatest potential, right? And that's what power is. Power, poder, means the ability to act, right? So when we hold relationships and are really honest about how power operates within and without those relationships, that's when we potentiate our communities, our neighborhoods, and our organizations to have the greatest ability to act on the kind of vision for the world that we all, I believe, hope to build.
And I echo to everything Elan just said, but I just want to pick up a little bit on his talking about acknowledging power as it exists today. We use as sort of the primary image in the book pyramids, and the fact that virtually every organization that we know in our society today, whether it's religious or academic or governmental or corporate, uses a pyramid-shaped structure, right? An organizational chart that is in a triangular shape and in 3 dimensions of pyramid. And as we thought more about that, and we realized, that's not something that we reached through our theological understandings or convictions. That's a cultural inheritance. That goes directly back to the Egyptians and the pyramids as the seat of stability and certainty and unchangingness. I do think that our religious traditions, the ones I'm familiar with anyway, give us a sort of ambivalence about power, a reluctance to even acknowledge that there is power in our relationships. And until we do that, come to terms with the existence of power and the way we exercise it in our relationships with one another and in our structures, I don't think we can make the shift to the kind of shared power that Elan was just talking about and that we hope for, of finding, using our power to help every person flourish.
So, this theme of how power manifests, like how it shows up, and particularly that it shows up between us and in relationship, how we are in relationship with each other, is something that um, you demonstrate, you talk about in the book, and you of course follow the biblical figure of Moses, but you do this beautiful thing as you highlight and use examples of real people doing ministry and living out a kind of new way of embodying power. And one of those is Diamond Hargis, who's taught us a lot about the power of relationships and relational capital. So when you think about the spiritual movement today that is happening, and this is a question for everybody, not just Elan and Kathi. So Vipin, would love for you to jump in, but um, who is embodying it, and what are they doing? What does it look like? What can we learn from them? What does this manifestation of power look like?
Well, here's what's coming up for me in response to that question. I was just with Damon a month ago in one of his gatherings, and what struck me about that was 95% of people across the 2.5 days of gathering, they kept saying, "I'm here because of Damon." 95%, right? Not just for the vision of the conference, not before the intention. All that was important, but I'm here. And I heard it so many times. I've heard so many people articulate. I got curious, like, what's going on here, right? Like, yes, of course, Damon is a powerful human being. He's so soulful and caring. But I think one of the sources of his power is the way he has gone about building his work in the world, where there is an intentionality around nurturing the relational fields between people, the nurturing the neighborhoods. He shows up, he goes, walks around and have conversations with people. And when we talk about power, there is a quality of that power which is so attractive to what Elan was saying. It's the quality of presence. It's the quality of power which comes through a human being when you listen, when there is no agenda, with genuine curiosity, with genuine care. And the second piece there, the quality of power which comes through, is when we speak truth to each other. So be in touch with our most authentic, vulnerable truthfulness, and creating the spaces for people to share that with each other. What that unlocks is that quality of intimacy and tenderness, which is the foundational aspects of any human friendship. So I would say the power which comes through genuinely caring and investing in the human being and not just the human doing part of it. So that's one response.
So I think it's interesting that as all three of you have talked about power so far, you have used words like vulnerability, trust, truth, shared, relationship. And can I just say that those aren't words that usually come to mind when we think about power, like culturally? I mean, to your point, Kathi, about the kind of inherited understandings about how things should be or are around power, but even how things are organized. And um, I mean, this feels like a significant shift of understanding, but also practice. And and we see this in the emerging spiritual landscape because I think when we think entrepreneur, we think the lone entrepreneur out there doing their crazy idea thing that, may or may not explode and come to fruition and do amazing things or whatever. But that's how we think of entrepreneurs. And when we think about spiritual entrepreneurs and innovators, it, it's not that. It's something much different. And I think you all are getting at it when you talk about vulnerability and trust and truth. And so can you talk a little bit about that shift that's happening from lone to shared leadership?
Yeah, I think this is something that we at our best are going to be able to speak into being, right? In our most divine moments, right? That's like kind of the definition of what God's able to do, speak into being. In our most divinely inspired moments, that's what we're going to be able to do, is speak it into being. And the reason why I say it that way is because it's actually not the lived reality for most of the folks, spiritual or otherwise, who are working as entrepreneurs. Like, tell me who's the number 2 at Tesla, who's the number 2 at OpenAI, who's the number 2 at Facebook, who's the number 2. We don't know. Why? Because that's not the model that we swim in. Who's the number 2 at GE, GM? Forget startups. Let's talk about legacy. We don't know. We don't know. And the reason why is because that's the culture that we're in. And now I think we've moved in this little sector of spiritual innovation. I think we've moved to be able to talk about and really artfully and thoughtfully critique that model, and then talk about this aspirational model of shared power, relational power, really reflecting on the ways that spirit moves through and between us. And we don't really live it out yet. Certainly not across the board, certainly not unanimously, and certainly not as the normative mode of operation. But I think the more that we speak about it, the more that it becomes common parlance for us to talk in those, using the same words, Lisa, that you just lifted up, then I think we can start to build in some checks and balances and some loving accountability. Hey, Elan, just the other day you were talking about shared responsibility, and then during this, faculty meeting, you went on a 30-minute tirade about how, I don't know, the coffee's not hot enough, whatever it is, right? But if the more that we speak about it publicly, honestly, vulnerably, and using I terms, like, this is how I aspire to lead in the world, the better that our community, those who we hold in power and in love, can invite us to actually live into those values, to live into that vision. But really, I think it is what I fear, and I don't think we're there, but what I fear is that we, in this small niche who are talking about spiritual innovation and spiritual faith rooted, all of that, entrepreneurship and innovation, that we celebrate how far we've come and don't continue pushing towards that goal, that vision that we've held for a long time. I've been in conversation, thank God, with so many of you for years, and my aspiration, and I'm going to speak just for myself, is that that I don't rest on my own laurels, and celebrate how far we've come without continuing to push for how far we still have to go.
I'm hoping Vipin will respond too, but I just want to echo and sort of broaden the question that this issue, I think, is not just an innovative space that we look to these heroic entrepreneurs, innovators. It's deep in our bones. I'm just starting as the new pastor in a little church that's been around for a long time, and the first thing they asked me is, "How would you like your name on the sign in front of the church?" And I felt like, wait, why is my name going on the sign in front of the church? You people have been the church for years, right? The church doesn't change because I come, but that is our tradition. I think in our church history as well as innovation history, that the leader is raised up almost like the leader embodies the whole mission and work of our organizations. And I think Elan's right. We need to be very intentional about speaking and acting our way into change about that.
I think first we need to recognize that how we got here. When we talk about power and what Kathi just said, I don't know if I want my name on this thing. We need to also understand that from a human development perspective. Every single time when we had a lock leader come to us and when we work our retreat work with them, there is this growing longing to live my life not aligned with my personality, my achievements, my PhDs, but in alignment with that which is larger than oneself. Call it spirit, call it sacred, call it Jesus, call it Buddha. It really doesn't matter what we call it. So, and it's a developmental arc. When Ram Dass talks about this idea of in the second act of life, you go from being somebody to becoming nobody, right? The ego personality sense of self starts dissolving, and all the heart's longing is about living in alignment with that something which is greater than ourselves. So by that logic, what we mean by power starts radically transforming not to human power, but spirit's power, and each and every one of us being a conduit for that expression of that in the world. That's one. The second perspective which I want to offer is just this recognition that when we talk about entrepreneurship moving from the individual into the collective, one of the reasons why we need to do that is also because there are two reasons. One, no one human being has the answers to any of the complex problems which we are facing today. The world has changed or is changing or it's already changed, right? So no one brain has the answer. So if I need to build something out into the world as an entrepreneur, I need how Lisa looks at the world and Kathi looks at the world and Elan looks at the world and Blair looks at the world to make my intervention much more holistic, much more impactful, much more sustainable. So it's just that's two pieces to be considered. Is the danger about the spiritual innovation conversation, I believe, in my perspective, is that we might end up making the same mistake we made with the social entrepreneurship sector, or the nonprofit sector, where what we did was we borrowed the rules of business and tried to apply it into a new game. You cannot play the game of rugby with the rules of baseball, right? The moment we understand that this spiritual innovation is not about Vipin's work in the world, but channeling spirit's presence and interest in this world, and I just being a conduit for that, the moment that recognition happens, our relationship with power transforms. At least that's what we are learning working with entrepreneurs who are stepping into the second season of their life.
Yeah. So you're drawing this into the realm of formation, right? How we are formed as in my language as disciples, as followers, as spiritual beings, and so that leadership comes back to that formation and how we are formed and shaped by God's work in us and through us, and how we lead from that place. And to your point, and Kathi, yours, that this isn't just about the role of spiritual innovation. This is about the work of the church. This is about how we show up in the world and manifest a different way of being that is the alternative narrative, to use Brueggemann's words. And so many of our listeners are leading congregations, and I'm curious what you all think is a question these leaders can be asking to begin to shift their own leadership, but also their organizations, their congregations' perspective away from pyramid and more toward a collaborative way of being together. What's a question they can be asking to make this shift?
I'll just say something to give Elan and Vipin another minute to think. But I realized in the course of doing the Changemaker work that sort of led me toward innovation that I had my whole life as a pastor essentially been saying to people, come here, come to church and bring your time and your energy and your resources, all of it. And all those other things you do outside the church, could you just do them a little less so you have more to bring here? Because together we can do something really wonderful. And so what I was asking people essentially was to trade in the engagements they already had in their lives for or something that was really about my project in the world, which was the institution of the church. And I think I really believe that we need to question that. We, as leaders of the church, need to question that. The reason the Changemaker work, I think, was so transformative for people is that we started by saying, what do you do in the world? Where do you work? Where do you go to school? What does your family call you into? What are the other volunteer commitments you have? And how can we help? How can the church help you do those things with a different character as a person of faith, becoming a compassion driven change maker like Jesus? And it was that was transformative, is that people felt like, really? Wait, I get to do what I want to do instead of what you want me to do, or something that helps your organization? It was it was just illuminating for me to realize how long I had missed that.
Yeah. I would add to what Kathy said. So, yes, I have a question which I might suggest, but what's equally important is how are you asking the question? So, and by that, how I mean is, can I, someone who's leading the church, can you invite people first before you ask the question to slow down, to find stillness, to take that deep, long exhale? And the moment when you enable people to do that, you're helping them access an intelligence which is deeper than your thinking mind, the intelligence of the body, the intelligence of spirit. So you create the conditions. Slowing down is one of the primary conditions to have meaningful conversations, pausing. And the second question is to ask, this is a question we asked last week with a group of lock leaders, is to be asking the question, where do you sense the presence of Spirit's work in the world? Where do you sense the absence of Spirit's work in the world? And I'm not even saying in the world, in your life, in your family, in your work situation. So the moment you're able to bring it to such a point, I think what that does is enables people to take that moment to reflect, and then saying, okay, how might we shift that? And the third and the most important question in my perspective, and one of the reasons power gets so misused, coming back to the topic of this conversation, is to also have, as a leader, as a pastor, to also ask the question, what's the blind spot of my leadership in the world? How am I coming in the way of a larger grace to flow through me? So, and I'm pointing to the territory of shadow work, right? Like the blind spot of leadership. So one of the great questions to ask at the end of the day before you go to bed is to take 5 minutes and ask the question, how am I being an asshole today? With whom have I been an asshole today? And the moment you ask that question, what it enables you to do is to see the behaviors which you do unconsciously and bring it into conscious light. And the moment you can bring shadow into light, it transforms. So just that piece, which doesn't get a lot of airtime when we talk about leadership in the world, the shadow dimension of leadership, just highlighting that.
I bet that wasn't the question that you thought you were going to put down in the show notes. How have I been? A great question, Vipin. Look, I'll share just briefly. I think the biggest question to ask is who do you want to be in the drama? Because there's always going to be drama. There's unfolding drama happening, and I don't mean drama like high school. I mean there is always an unfolding drama happening around us, and the question is, what role do we want to play in that drama as it unfolds? I think that one of the great challenges of this, like the quote unquote leadership development field, is that it tends to be a bunch of people at the front of the room telling a bunch of people not at the front of the room to be more like me. Because I've got the leadership answers. I've got that. By the way, that was one of the most challenging things about the book that Kathi and I wrote, and the process of writing the book, let alone pitching it. Because you pitch it to a publisher. Okay, so what's the model of leadership? What did we say? We don't really know. We can tell you mistakes that we've made that we know are not the kind of leader we want to be, not the kind of person we want to be, but there's no blueprint in that book. If there were, maybe they'd be selling it at Hudson News, right? Or the Hudson Booksellers, or, like in the airport when you buy all the self-help books, right? But it's not, and that's okay. But I think that I think one of the activities, one of the activities that I did that changed my life was in my last day of rabbinical school before becoming ordained as a rabbi. One of my teachers, Reb Mimi Feigelson, had us write our eulogy. And that was, now for me, that was incredibly hard. I had lost my father just a few years before that. And just 2 years before being ordained, I was hit by a pickup truck going 40 miles an hour and was on my deathbed. Like I was in critical condition. And so I had already run through the eulogy plenty of times, but to sit down on the day before becoming ordained as a rabbi and actually reflect on who and what I wanted to become in whatever
Mm.
time God will gift me on this earth was an incredibly important exercise. And I think about it all the time. And for me, there's a story that Martin Buber, late great philosopher, there's a story he told of Rabbi Zusia of Hanipol. And on Zusia's deathbed, he begins to cry uncontrollably, just sobbing with his whole body shaking. And his students come to him and they say, you've lived such a good life. You've been so great. You've done so many wonderful things. Why are you crying? You're as wise as Moses. You were as hospitable as Abraham was. There's no question God and the heavens will judge you with great favor. And he said, yeah, that's sure. When I get to heaven, I'm not going to worry too much if God asks me, Zusia, why weren't you more like Abraham? I won't worry if God asks me, Zusia, why were you not more like Moses? Right? I wasn't born with Abraham's righteousness. I wasn't born with Moses's faith and wisdom, but I tried to do my best to be as hospitable and kind and loving and wise as I could. But what am I going to say when God asks me, Zusia, why were you not more like Zusia? I think that's the question. That's the leadership question, is who are you and how can you be more like you? I think if that's the question that we can invite people to really sit with in earnestness and honestness and vulnerability, my goodness, I think we can help others unlock so much in themselves about becoming more of themselves.
Yeah. I so appreciate that each of you has challenged leaders in the church and in congregations to do their work, right? I mean, you haven't said here's the blueprint or do these three things, but actually it's about each of us doing our own work and in conversation with God. And that, again, it comes back to that formation, right? And that in that we can show up with each other in a new way, because God is always going to draw us into relationship with each other because of the essence of who God is. And Vipin, I want to circle back to you because I know you have worked on and with a team, I know, with this togetherness practice, and in a way, it is. There's some ritual and practice, quite literally, around this work that we're talking about. So I would love for you to share what it is, maybe a wee story about what led you to develop it, and then how have you seen it kind of offer leaders and individuals and folks a path, if you will, to this kind of introspection, but also relationship with God and one another. So, yeah,
Yeah,
I'll turn it to you, Vipin.
happy to. Well, so for the longest time in my life, I wanted to find or discover or co-create the Alcohol Anonymous version for human transformation.
Mm,
Not personalities, not priests or pastors, not but principles which any group of human beings anywhere in the world can come together to support each other in actualizing their individual and collective highest potential. That was the dream, those kind of stories
mm,
we tell ourselves. And a few years ago, by a lot of grace and luck, a group, I got some resources to form a team. We started interviewing social entrepreneurs, business entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, education entrepreneurs. And we chose entrepreneurs because these were the people who are living, they had no problems giving themselves the permission to create positive change in the world. So that's why we chose that group of human beings. And so we were tracking what happens at the soul level of an entrepreneur. So after 170 conversations over 2.5 years of research, what surprised or what came out of it was what we are now currently calling the togetherness practice. And again, I went searching for principles, and what we got was a practice. And the reason why we emphasized it's a framework and it is a practice. And the reason why those two are important is because there's no shortage of frameworks in the world. One Google search, thousands of frameworks. But what we were very invested in is to say, how do you build a framework which can lend itself to practices? So the togetherness practice is a framework and a practice. And for those of you, I'm a visual learner, so it's easier for me to share something visually. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen. So what it is, it's a changemaker's instrument for activating individual and collective potential. So it is designed for changemakers. It's designed for leaders. It's designed for pastors or facilitators or people who see themselves in their role. So what the research said very quickly was there were 3 dimensions of change. One is internal capacities. What are the capacities we need to cultivate within oneself, in ourselves, to thrive in times of rapid change? So what the research showed was 4 dimensions: awareness, slowing down, sensing, meaning making. How are we making meaning of the complexity which we are living in the world today? Self-permission and responsibility. So if you are a leader, so all the 4 of you on the call, just take a moment, take a breath, and just check in with yourself. Which one of these dimensions or muscles are you really good at? Do you practice on a daily basis? And which one of them you need to pay attention to? You haven't been practicing. It's a muscle which you've been ignoring. So that's the internal capacities. But then the second piece of the puzzle was, it's not just, there's this beautiful line of leadership. It says the only role of a leader is to create new leaders. So as a leader, when you're working with teams, how do you create a culture? How do you create the conditions which helps everyone else in your team to discover their own highest potential? So what we looked at was the conditions. The research said was, in my team, so right now, the 4 of you, look at the teams you're a part of. Is there a culture of receptivity, curiosity, openness, truth seeking? Do you as a team, in your team, slow down often enough to reflect? Are we making the impact which we hoped, we desired, which we long for to make? Is there a sense of belonging? Do we belong to each other as we work for a large vision? Is there a sense of connection? How are we responsive? And finally, the quality of emergence, which is becoming, and how are we engaging patterns? So this was February 2023. We were feeling pretty pleased with ourselves. We had a nice website, good color combinations, internal and external, but something felt missing. And the breakthrough, an aha moment happened was when we realized that if religion has, for thousands of years, have talked about doing inner work on ourselves, but the world hasn't changed. In the last 40, 50 years, the nonprofit world came in and started talking about changing the systems we are a part of, but we are not close to solving any one social problem. So if you look at the inner and the outer at 2 slices of a sandwich, what we have ignored or what we haven't yet paid a lot of attention to is that transformational change happens in the relational spaces between us. So, and that's hence the togetherness practice. So when we create change in the world, how are we tending to the relational spaces between human beings? So what we discovered was, anytime a team comes together, or any group of human beings in a congregation, in a classroom, comes together, how do you slow down to pausing, to take that deeper, longer exhale? When things are not working in teams, how do you find the patterns? Like, how can the places of breakdowns can be the portal for a breakthrough? How do we create a culture of trusting or truthfulness where we can be authentic and real with each other? And from that energetic space, how do you enact? How do you take action in the world? So that's the framework of the togetherness practice and what we are building out right now. Human relationships are hard. There is a reason why we ignore vulnerability and stay in our head and talk about conceptual frameworks. So, what we've built out is practices which are 90 seconds, 90 minutes, 90 hours, 90 days, and 90 years. Because we will always be in relationships till the way we die. So, we are thinking about the togetherness practice as the spaces. How do we lend itself as the when we are going and starting a new project, before we bring in our slides and PowerPoint presentation and our speeches? How are we with each other, like in this moment? How are we? What's our relational field like? And paying attention to that, what we are discovering is just unlocks trust, unlocks connection, unlocks friendship, unlocks love, from which we can have any conversation in the world, right? Without being polarizing with each other. So the last sentence which I'll say, and this is a thing which deeply touches me, and the reason I'm doing this work, in a country, in a world which is so polarized, what the togetherness practice is doing, or it's designed to do, is helping us to rediscover our shared humanity. So you might vote for Republicans or I might for Democrats, but you're a mother and I'm a parent. You like to going to the YMCA. That shared sense of relational connection of humanity just seems so precious and important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I am fascinated both by the evolution of this, where you kind of realized, oh, wait, it's not just inner and outer, it's the relational field, which brings us full circle back to Elan at the very beginning saying, you can't know what the power is in the room or the dynamics until you experience the relationships and how we treat one another, how we show up, how it manifests. And so to have formed practices that actually build that relational field and that trust is just a beautiful entry into this shift we're talking about from kind of the lone, leader, entrepreneur power to what it means to truly collaborate and share. It's beautiful.
It's worth noting, by the way.
Lisa, as you describe that,
Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, it strikes me as such a risk-taking way of being for a leader in the world, to focus on the relational field instead of accomplishing the vision, right? It's such an indirect path to get there. As everyone has said, it's hard work, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, Elan, you go ahead.
That's what I was going to say, but less eloquently. So you win.
Yeah. I so appreciate that you are naming the courage that it takes to do this, to be a leader in a different way. Yeah. In this kind of way.
Well, my friends, no doubt there's 8 hours of more conversation we should have about this. But part of what I get to do is ask you some questions we call rapid fire, which feels like I feel self-conscious saying that out loud after we've just heard Vipin talk about slowing down and the tone of this conversation. But these are short answer questions and there are a few of them. So let me just ask them and invite each of you to respond, and then we'll move to the next one. First one is this: what's the most unexpected place where you are seeing instances of power shifting away from, let's say, the pyramid structure and toward more collaboration? The most unexpected place you're seeing that happen.
Taylor Swift. It's 2 words, Taylor Swift, 100%. This is somebody who has 58 million Americans who identify as Swifties, right? In our space, we always talk about who identifies as spiritual, who identifies as Christian or Jewish. The 58 million people will say, are you a Swiftie? Yes, I am. And they operate with tremendous power. Now, does everything they do, bring about goodness in the world. I don't know enough about this stuff. I shouldn't even be talking about it, but I can tell you my 8-year-old daughter likes Taylor Swift, so she's probably one of them, right? But um, when they see something unjust happening to Taylor or happening to something they care about, they will operate in a block with an incredible amount of power, right? Again, I'm not giving a quality to that power, but I'm telling you they're incredibly powerful. And I think there is so much to learn from us in this space. Like, I think we have so much to learn. By the way, there's 32 million in Beyonce's Bayhive, which I'm probably pronouncing right. Like, there are massive blocks of people. Now, here's the dark side. There's 1 in 6 Americans believes in QAnon. Okay, and they operate as such. So I want to be clear that we are watching. You can look at it from a negative, say it's cult-like behavior. And I would also argue that any of these 3 groups, Swifties, Bayhive, QAnon, that they operate in many of the same ways. They have rituals, they have practices, they have pilgrimages where they're going to a concert or they're gathering in DC for a protest or a rally. They have so many of the tenets of what we think of as religious identity, and they are operating with a great deal of power in the world. So I'm not saying go join a Swiftie club or become part of the Bayhive or, listen to what QAnon has to say. But what I think we have an incredible amount to learn about new power and how it is operating. These are folks who have never met each other, who believe so vehemently in one idea, one ideal, maybe an idol also, but who believe so deeply in it that they will operate using that relational power. And I do think there's a great deal for us to learn.
Well, I'll admit that I was not expecting Elan to first start with Taylor Swift. So, hey, power. It's such a interesting and refreshing perspective, right? Like there is power there, and we should be open to ourselves, open to that, to understand that and learn from that. What comes up for me though is finding entrepreneurs, working with them in a season of their life where they are willing to give power away, right? These are individually incredibly powerful human beings, but they're creating spaces where they are putting other people ahead of them, their team, prioritizing their teams, prioritizing their community stakeholders, and letting them get the limelight and the credit. And what that is doing is that it's such a giving away power is actually makes them more powerful. And this one group of people you should totally look at if you're interested in learning from them is the lock leaders, which the Wesleyan Impact and the TMF team has been supporting. They're getting, and even what Kathi said, like when she was talking about her name on the board, there is getting to a season of their life where their human power is not as interesting anymore. They want to get into being conduits of a larger power, of a larger grace, the self as an instrument. And it is a developmental trajectory they are getting into. So yeah, that's my quick response.
Great. Thank you. The next question invites you to take a sort of inward turn. And so the question is, do you have a favorite book or a sacred text that grounds and humbles you?
I do have a sacred practice, and that practice is slowing down. I suck at it, which is one of the reasons why I deeply believe in it. But it's the quality of presence and the presence to be with everything in this moment as it is. And yeah, slowing down and being able to listen deeply. So that's my practice these days.
Great. So, Elan, let me broaden the question to you then. So, a text or a book or a practice that grounds you.
I'll share very briefly. It was a book that came out recently called "A Painter and His Art Dealer." My wife Lizzie and I celebrated our 15th anniversary, and we went to Paris in the fall. and we saw an exhibit featuring the work of Amedeo Modigliani, who was an early 20th century artist who was part of this big sort of artistic renaissance that was happening in the early 20th century. Happens to be Jewish, and he was in Europe kind of just up until the point that it was no longer okay to be Jewish in Europe. And but what I found so profound, he painted these. It is so clear the love in each of the paintings of his art dealer named Paul Guillaume. And I read the story about their relationship, that essentially Modigliani had just been painting. He was just sort of part of this crew of artists and, creative types, but he wasn't Modigliani yet until Guillaume discovered him. And they developed this loving, nurturing relationship. Guillaume held all the power, to be clear. He was the art dealer. He was the one who ran the galleries. He was the one with all the power. But they held such a beautiful, symbiotic, loving relationship throughout their lives together as friends. And so I think of this as my answer to this amazing question is, I look to that book because what it reminds me of is that there are people waiting for their gifts to be discovered everywhere. There is a Modigliani in every room that you step into. There are hundreds of them in every room you step into. And so what invites me to do the practice is to look for the gifts, to be fully aware of the gifts, and also to be aware of the gifts in myself that I haven't let out into the world, and that I'm waiting to be discovered too, because there is so much there. There are so many gifts waiting to come out.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So we have one final question we're asking all our guests this season, and it's drawing on Kenda Creasy Dean's image. So she says that when she thinks of the future church, she doesn't see like one big thing coming. She sees a lot of small boats. So what is a small boat that you see that gives us a glimpse of the future church?
So what comes up for me is what's the quality of relationships between the people who are rowing the hundreds of boats, right? So that's one thing to consider. So how is there a practice of togetherness? Is there a practice of recognizing the sacred in each other? That's one. And the second thing, what for me is this recognition of the new church is not a big thing, but it is about how every human being gets to practicing their own relationship with the three faces of the sacred, or the three faces of the God: the sacred inside us, the sacred between us, and the sacred around us. So the togetherness practice is not a new thing. It's as old as the time, the Trinity, right? The three faces of God. So the new church or the new religion is just the practice, that intentionality of deepening relationship with the self here, the sacred between, and the sacred around us.
Where I'm seeing hope in the small boats metaphor, which I just love and I think about it all the time, is I truly believe that we are moving into a moment in which folks are more willing to recognize that even if they're not sharing a boat, someone else, or even if their boat's moving in the opposite direction as someone else, that we actually are all in the same waters. And that is, of course, in a polarized society, it's hard to see that manifesting out in the world. And yet so many of the small boat captains that I've met along the way recognize how shared their destiny is with the rest of the folks that are rowing wherever it is they're rowing off to. And I find that so deeply hopeful, that there is a recognition that even if our paths might never cross again, that we still breathe the same air, we still get impacted when the tides go in and go out, and we are doing our best to plug the holes in these little rowboats that are taking us wherever we're going.
Yeah. And isn't that the heart of it? We are in this together. This exercise, this adventure of life is not a solo adventure, right? We're in this together. So I want to say thank you to both of you. You are doing such beautiful and powerful work in this spiritual landscape. And we at TMF and Wesleyan Impact Partners are better for it, stretched by, challenged by, and encouraged by your work. And I see your fingerprints all over the place in the spiritual landscape that is emerging. So thank you both for the work that you're doing and for being in relationship with us. It means a lot.
Thank you.
Right.